So I now welcome a representative from the Jewish Climate Network and the Executive Council of Jury. Oh, we've got someone on video conference too. Excellent. So I should say I now welcome representatives. So I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please each state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? I might start with you first, Joel. Yeah.
My name is Joel Lazar and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Climate Network.
Great. Simone?
Hi, my name is Simone Abel and I'm the Head of Legal at Executive Council of Australian Jury.
Great. So I now invite you both, if you'd like to, or between you, to make an opening statement, and we'll ask you some questions after that.
Thank you. I'll begin. The Jewish Climate Network is grateful to the committee for undertaking this important inquiry and for inviting us to participate today. We are a non-partisan organisation that has worked with over 14,000 Jews in Australia on education and projects about climate change and clean energy. We made our submission to this inquiry because, as a uniquely Jewish climate organisation, because we in our community have centuries of direct and lived experience of perhaps the oldest and most studied type of disinformation in human history, namely conspiracies about Jews. The vast majority of Jews in this country have personally felt the effects of anti-Jewish disinformation, including many of our grandparents who survived the Holocaust, a horror built on deceptive disinformation. When we saw that this inquiry had been set up to investigate the mechanics of mis and disinformation about climate change and energy, as a climate-focused organisation built on Jewish values and history, we naturally felt we had an important and unique perspective to offer. What we know from direct experience and decades of research is that the mere articulation of harmful ideas about Jewish people in the public sphere causes harm, no matter how illogical, false or far-fetched they may be. It is a genie that cannot be put back in the bottle. There are strong parallels here to mis and disinformation about climate change and energy. The mere expression of a false or misleading claim immediately causes irreversible harm. For example, one social media post on X in 2023 suggested that the wildfires in Hawaii that killed at least 102 people were caused by, you guessed it, space lasers. One might think this fringe idea doesn't warrant any attention, but this single post, and there were more than one, from a verified X account, was viewed by no fewer than 2.8 million people. How do you have a sensible debate about climate mitigation or adaptation if the cause of the problem is falsely attributed to a space laser? The damage is already done. What we also know from the research is that belief in one conspiracy theory tends to predict belief in other conspiracy theories. A conspiratorial mentality might therefore predispose people to believing both climate and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, as well as believing mis and disinformation about other groups in Australia. We argue that better understanding these phenomena may help combat disinformation about climate and energy, as well as tackling falsehoods that undermine Australia's broader social fabric. JCN is therefore proposing that any solutions this committee recommends to the government be designed as holistically as possible. With government resources already stretched thin, it would be a deep shame and waste of time to have an inquiry of this kind for each type of mis and disinformation that harms Australian society. The Jewish Climate Network therefore strongly encourages solutions that solve as many challenges at once, and in doing so supports all Australians to prosper. In short, let's keep as many genies in their bottles as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Did you have anything to add, Ms. Abel?
I'll give a quick opening statement if that's all right with you. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands we meet on today and to pay our respects to all elders past and present and to the children of today who are the elders of our future. This inquiry is a crucial step in addressing misinformation and disinformation with regard to climate change and energy. The Executive Council of Australian Jury thanks the committee for inviting us to participate. As the ECAJ highlighted in its submission to the Senate Standing Committees on Environment and Communications in September 2024, All misinformation and disinformation is harmful to the fabric of our society, and one type of misinformation and disinformation can prime an audience for susceptibility to other types of misinformation and disinformation with harmful consequences. As the peak elected representative body of the Australian Jewish community, we bring to this inquiry the lived experience of our community with respect to the harmful impacts of misinformation and disinformation. The late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks identified how disinformation helps anti-Semitism to mutate and latch onto the dominant values of any era. As climate change is a dominant concern of our era, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have developed, which both suggest that Jews are responsible for causing climate change and, paradoxically, that Jews invented climate change as one of the tools by which they seek global control. For example, Trayon White Sr., a member of the District of Columbia Council in Washington, posted a video in March 2018 which alleged that the Jewish banking dynasty Rothschild family controls the climate. In the US, some extremist voices have sought to draw a link between the Los Angeles wildfires and Jewish community advocacy. These anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, built on tropes such as the global domination power trope, create hostility towards Jews in environmental movements and feed a cancel culture whereby the quest for information is deprioritized if it does not fit a particular narrative, thereby undermining the prospect of finding real solutions to one of the greatest challenges of our time. It is for this reason that the solutions to the problem before the committee go beyond the climate change and energy areas. The ECAJ and the Jewish Climate Network both support a holistic approach to this issue, as Joel explained, with the ECAJ calling for media literacy education aimed at ensuring future generations have the ability to thoughtfully review and assess information. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for appearing today and for your submissions. Yeah, I was certainly very interested in your submission and the crossover. I've just was wondering. I probably should know the answer to this, but if someone online, for example, and it's verifiable, their identity is verifiable, and they're putting up a conspiracy theory around the Holocaust or around Jewish control of the world, is that covered? Would that be covered under the racial discrimination laws in Australia? Like, would that be potentially criminal, or could that be criminalised?
I'll give that to Simone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've identified a real problem. Yes, we do have the Racial Discrimination Act and we have Section 18C, racial vilification. However, it's extremely costly. And you may have heard recently of the Wertheim versus Haddad case, which concerned this issue. So it can be very costly for communities or individuals who are impacted by the type of disinformation you've identified to take action. In some instances, that type of disinformation may verge on criminal conduct, in which case the police may be able to take action, but more often than not, the content remains online, and it's really just a question of how much harm it causes. And in the case of our community, particularly over the last 2 years, the harm has been very significant. So there's been a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have in turn been linked to anti-Semitic incidents and discourse that have arisen, which have caused, real harm in the physical world for our community.
Yeah. So the harms that these kind of things cause is indisputable, and the information itself is easily identified as either disinformation deliberately spread or misinformation. So therefore, you can, in law, accepting, of course, it's not an easy thing to do. Do you think with climate change, the harm is there's acceptance of the harm that climate's doing, and how easy is it to identify something as disinformation or misinformation? Obviously, I'm just looking at the two comparisons where I think you've got a really good example with 18C and how you could potentially criminalise disinformation that's doing harm, but maybe not so easily with climate.
Yeah, I think there'll be people who are more expert than us at how you might draft laws that protected freedom of speech and expression, which is a very important value in democratic society, and not overreaching in this case. Because, misinformation, disinformation in the context of climate you need to obviously define what it is, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of explanations today about what it might be, which is that a piece of information has no basis in fact or no robust evidence base and things like that. Whereas an evidence base for harm against Jews that's a different type of conversation to have. Simone would probably agree with me. You're looking at a harms-based approach when you're talking about hate speech or violence, whereas in the case of climate change and energy, you're looking at whether or not a particular thing has a robust basis for evidence, whether the piece of information being proposed flatly contradicts that, and then, of course, what kind of consequence arose from that, like what actually were the potential harms. So in the case of, say, the Hawaiian space laser example, you could argue that how could the local council or the local government start to plan for these types of disasters in the future if suddenly the well has been poisoned, so to speak, by a debate about space lasers. And we had similar things with Cyclone Alfred here as well, where we can't actually sit down and talk about how to prepare for a proper future. And that obviously impacts people's lives. Yeah.
Did a US politician talk about space lasers as well?
Possibly. I'm not sure.
I won't mention their name, but I'm pretty sure I read online that one of them had commented about space lasers. As a matter of interest, we've been monitoring it with the algal bloom in South Australia, for example, the marine heat wave there with coral bleaching, with dead turtles washing up on the beach in Newcastle. Within hours, there's hundreds of comments around Chinese submarines being responsible, desalination plants that aren't even in those areas or states. It's quite interesting to work. One of the things we're looking at is whether bots or trolls, how these organised campaigns online work.
Yeah.
Could I ask, in your submission, you state that some conspiracy theories allege that global elites, including international bankers, are responsible for fabricating the issue of climate change for financial gain. Simone, you mentioned the Rothschilds example in your statement, and that these conspiracies bear striking similarities to long-standing anti-Jewish myths about Jewish control over international finances. When we see something that doesn't actually, for example, mention the word Jewish or Jew in it, are we to assume that it is anti-Semitic? Is that?
Well, what we would say to that is that might be a case of what we would call coded language. And coded language has got the word code in it for a reason. It's that some people are good at deciphering the code and other people are not. The people who are usually best placed to decipher the code of coded language are the people who historically have experienced the harms of that language. So it's very easy for the average Jewish person to see from a million miles away when there's an allusion to Jewish or Jewish family, something to do with money and banking, that's a hundred-year-long trope about Jews and money. And Jews initially were prevented from participating in most professions in society, so they were forced into the few remaining ones that were available, one of which was money lending. And so that's the origin of that trope and that myth about Jews being hungry for money and things like that. So we know that, we've experienced that, our great-grandparents have all experienced that and have been ostracised and dehumanised and killed for those reasons. You can never be 100% certain that the person who used those phrases or those words intended to cause harm to Jews or even had Jewish people in mind when they did it. But what we would say is that that's the way biases often work, is that you say things you're actually often not even aware where you got that idea from. It's just kind of something, it's a soup that you swim in from birth, so to speak. And so what we would say is we would encourage people to first acknowledge that the people who understand the harms, like Jewish people, have a right to define what that harm could be, and then to encourage them to use different language, and at least to admit that was a misplaced use of phrase, and I'd rather use something else.
Yeah.
Maybe specify a specific bank. Maybe say it was this bank or that bank. Yeah. Finance this particular. So often it's around particularities versus generalizations. The more general and sweeping you get, the more likely you are to be caught in that web of harmful coded language.
Could I read you a quote from an Australian politician? Predatory parasitic billionaires owning near-urban intensive production facilities are producing food-like substances for the masses, forcing the public into acceptance of the World Economic Forum's fake global warming scam. These are their own stated motives: control food and control people. Whoever controls the food supply controls the people. Whoever controls the energy can control the continents. Whoever controls money can control the whole world. The World Economic Forum and predatory billionaires they represent are trying to do all three. Would that be included under your reflections, your previous reflections, or do you think that's a bit too broad for
You read it very quickly, so I'd have to sort of sit down and look at each of the words and phrases, so it's hard to say. Nothing immediately jumped out to me as having coded sort of anti-Jewish disinformation language, but it could. I'd have to sit down and really kind of go through it line by line.
I'll provide you a copy.
Yeah, please.
Copy of it after. Deputy Chair, would you like to?
Yeah, hi. As someone who's a passionate advocate for climate action in your community, can you perhaps outline for us some of the misinformation narratives that you've come across and what effect it has had on the advocacy work that you're doing?
Are you referring to misinformation about climate change and energy? We don't actually experience a lot of it, I would say, in our community. I see it, a lot around in society and online and from various testimonies that have been brought to the inquiry today. We see a lot of robust debate about the right policy ideas and solutions that should respond to the problem of climate change, which we encourage. And it comes up a lot in household conversations that we have with people trying to explain what should we do about the problem of climate change. And there's debate about what types of energy sources might be the best ones, how much is it going to cost, the impact on migrant communities or poorer communities and things like that. So they would be that's probably the majority of the kind of challenging, tense conversations that we would see. The more obvious ones around renewable energy that you might see in regional areas, because Jewish population centres don't happen to often be in those areas. They're not, in and amongst all those classic ones that you might hear from, day to day. Nothing strong immediately jumps out. Occasionally I'll have a one-to-one conversation with someone who might say something outlandish, but it's not actually a lot more than that. I think there's generally quite a broad, deep respect for debate about differences of opinion in the Jewish community, and there's a vast difference between opinion and fact. People are obviously entitled to their opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts, and I think mostly people accept that.
I guess it comes down to also accepting that there are shared facts, and sometimes people don't accept the basis of the science, which makes things quite challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely get the occasional conversation which says, well, is climate change really happening, and are humans really responsible? And that would be the main one, where there's just a sort of subtle sort of scepticism and doubt about whether or not this major problem is indeed a major problem. But I wouldn't say it's at all pervasive.
And how do you respond to that?
I say that there's a robust body of evidence, thousands and thousands of research papers, each composed by a person who has a lifetime of expertise, that over 97%, and Cornell University says over 99% of science papers confirm that climate change is happening, it's caused by humans, and that it's harmful. And that goes most of the way to do it. I don't think the people who have those conversations with me are necessarily interested in learning about what's in all of those papers. They just want to sort of have their day. Yeah. So
it sounds to me, just my final comment before we move on, it sounds to me like these counter-narratives are very much targeting constituencies in the regions, and that the Jewish community is very much an urbanised community, by the sounds of it, would be more immune from this or are not as exposed to this as the regional communities. Would that be fair on climate?
I just wanted to add in there, sorry, I didn't know if the sound was working. The one thing that we do actually hear quite a lot of at the ECAJ is environmental scientists of Jewish background increasingly feeling marginalised and kind of cancelled in rigorous scientific debate about these issues. And I think that's obviously harmful, and cancelled, I should elaborate, because of their identity and assumptions that are made about them. And so I think, that is something that needs to be looked at. And to your point about where it's happening, regional or urban, I mean, yes, the Jewish community is concentrated primarily in urban centres. However, there are peak bodies at the state level in every state and territory now for the Jewish community. And what's interesting is actually the problem is similar across the different states and territories in terms of how it manifests. And I think, it's a broader societal point, but it's the reason why the JCN and why the ECAJ has recommended, more kind of robust approaches at the educational level to ensuring that critical thinking is instilled from an early age and that people don't conflate issues. So, you may have someone who's presenting very credible evidence on climate and energy, for example. You may not like their personal politics. You may even hold views about them that are racist. And obviously, whilst we would condemn such views, that still should not cast any dispersions on whether or not the information that they're providing in the climate change and energy sphere is relevant, provided it's the outcome of rigorous research. So I just thought it was important to kind of contextualise some of the issues that our community is experiencing in this space at the moment.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm going to ask you some general questions and then two specifics. First of all, the terms of reference, first and second terms of reference, are about misinformation and disinformation for this inquiry. Misinformation, disinformation is not necessarily disagreement, is it? If you and I disagree, it doesn't necessarily mean one of us is misinformed. Or
Correct. It just means we have a difference of opinion on something.
Thank you. Skepticism is not misinformation, disinformation necessarily.
It could be, but not necessarily.
Right. Choosing a different interpretation of complex data is not necessarily misinformation, disinformation.
I'm not sure. That one is getting a little bit closer to the nature of the scientific method. And once we're in the realm of scientific method, I think we want to look at, does the person have expertise in the area, the person who's critiquing the nature of the data, so that they actually understand the data that they're looking at. There's peer review process involved in the scientific process. So who are those peers? Is that peer just a guy sitting at home, or do they have 40 years of climate science behind them? So I think we're getting a little bit closer to unsure.
Two scientists, climate scientists, which could be anyone from a geologist to a physicist to an astrophysicist, if they're disagreeing on the interpretation of correct data, is one of them misinforming?
It really depends on the data that they're looking at. I'd say two things. One is, just because they're a scientist also doesn't suffice. If they're a geologist, obviously their expertise is in geology. So if the data they're looking at is about weather systems, they're close to it. They're closer than, say, perhaps an accountant is. But that's not necessarily the area of expertise. And I would think many scientists would actually say, this actually isn't my direct area of expertise, so I'm not actually as equipped to answer that question. And to point two is, the one-to-one debate between scientists is less to the point. More to the point is, what does the body of evidence and what does the weight of evidence about a particular set of data say? So when we look at the 97% or the 99% statistic that you'll have heard, that's talking about tens of thousands of research paper sitting on one side of the body versus, maybe there's the odd scientist who thinks the opposite, and science goes heavily towards the weight of evidence developed over a very long period of time.
Well, geologists are one of the important climate scientists because climate science is a very broad aspect, and geology looks at the past of paleoclimate.
Yeah, I don't doubt that geologists have important things to say about the general climate sphere. It's just that each subsection of science has a very particular way of viewing the issue.
Under the discipline of rational thought, misinformation, disinformation is a claim that fails the test of logic, evidence, and transparency. Would you agree?
Logic, evidence, and transparency. Yeah, that sounds about right. You are saying it pretty quickly, but it sounds about right.
Slow down.
Evidence being the key.
Thank you. Objective evidence.
I'm not sure what objective adds, but evidence, yeah.
Misinformation, disinformation is a statement that misleads, not because someone dislikes it, but rather because it cannot withstand examination, critical examination.
By relevant experts in the field, yes.
So it may be unintentional, it may be sloppiness, it may at times be calculated deceit.
Yeah, some of those are misinformation, some of those are disinformation.
Okay. Now I have have you heard of a man called Maurice Strong?
I have not heard of Maurice Strong.
I'll move on. I'm very good friends with an elderly Jewish lady. She's a wonderful person, Holocaust survivor from Hungary. She's been through a lot. She was only 2 when she escaped the Holocaust in Hungary. She's a very, very prominent speaker against climate change narrative. She's also a very, very strong speaker in exposing the Jewish atrocities that have been committed against the Jews. Okay, and she goes around schools and other associations exposing that. How do you reconcile the fact that she's very well informed about the Jewish people being victims, but also very, very well informed about the climate science?
Well, what's her, what is her expertise? What is her background? What's her area of work and research? Is she a scientist herself?
A scientist is anyone who follows the scientific process.
Is she an academic?
No, she's not an academic.
I would say she sounds like an informed citizen who has an interest in the area, but in the space of building bodies of evidence, an individual, first of all, an individual is only ever an individual, even if they're an absolute genius and an academic in the area, they're still only one person, and they still stand against the weight of the body of evidence that's in favour of climate change existing. And she's one person, and she's not an expert, it sounds like, in the area of climate from an academic background. So she just sounds like a person who has experienced Jewish suffering, who understands the Jewish experience, and also has a view about climate change.
She's made herself very well informed of scientists internationally as well as in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I applaud her for doing so. I don't think they're contradictory, is all I would say. She happens to have an opinion on that and also cares about the Jewish experience. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Thank you. Can I just ask you, in terms of what you've presented today and in your submission, have you noticed changes, especially in the last 3 or 4 years since COVID, in terms of the level of disinformation or misinformation around, certainly not so much climate change itself, but racism and the kind of frames and tropes that you've put to us today?
I'll answer with one point.
I suppose, how enabled has the far right been in recent times in terms of this debate?
Well, I know of one example area that I'll give, and then Simone, I think you may know even more. I know that since COVID, it was pretty early on after when COVID started to harm our population that narratives and pieces of disinformation arose, basically arguing that the Jews were responsible for the spread of COVID. And you had graffiti of these things on Bunnings walls in the middle of nowhere, equating like Jew equals COVID sort of thing. I've got, pictures of it that I've considered before. So, I mean, that's everywhere. Often large-scale plagues and large-scale issues that are really complex and hard to explain, how their origins and how they spread. Those are the kind of gaps. That confusion is a ripe space, fertile territory to plug the gap with the Jewish people, basically. So that's one example that I know of in the last sort of 4 years. Simone, you might know of others. And also, maybe, Simone, if you have any comments on how mis or disinformation has impacted other minority groups in Australia. Obviously, we've experienced it, but I've no doubt, others are also feeling it.
Yes, absolutely. I think, there seems to be an echo there. I think, what we're interested in is the Venn diagram of where anti-Semitism also exists with people spreading disinformation regarding climate change or energy. And, this type of Venn diagram with respect to other issues like COVID is not a new phenomenon. So in 1996 and in 2009, the ECAJ brought legal proceedings against Australian-based Holocaust denial website, the Adelaide Institute, and its founder, Frederick Tobin. So that is to say that the issue of what's happening online and the disinformation and misinformation out there has been a problem pretty much since the inception of the internet. However, we have seen it explode very substantially. Now, we publish every year our annual anti-Semitism report, in which we analyse and review what we classify as anti-Semitic incidents. However, we are unable to analyse and collect quantitative data on what we classify as anti-Semitic discourse because it's so prevalent. So there's an organisation called the Online Hate Prevention Institute, which I really recommend, which provides a lot of information about trends and themes in online hate, and that's certainly an organisation whose work has been very useful for us. We do publish in our annual anti-Semitism report a summary of kind of the dominant anti-Semitic discourse of that 12-month reporting period. So as you said, during COVID, a lot of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were focused on, Jews spreading COVID, which is not, that's an ancient, borrows on an ancient anti-Semitic trope, which is the disease and filth trope, which was used during the Nazi era and has been used throughout the ages as well. So a lot of these things are not new phenomenon. It's just that they attach to whatever is the dominant values or issue of the day, as Joel said. And, the other thing we saw was during the Voice referendum, which was obviously very divisive in Australian society. Again, anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic incidents increased substantially during that period, and you'll probably see in the Jewish Climate Network submission there's one example of that. So unfortunately, as Joel said, anti-Semitism will often be used to explain the inexplicable or things that our society is really struggling with or is fearful or anxious about. And so whilst the techniques are not new, I would say that the problem has really skyrocketed, and, it's at the stage now where with the social media platforms, we are part of groups that audit, I suppose you could say, monitor online hate on various social media platforms and have dialogue with them. And there is just a really, really substantial problem, which is increasing by the day in terms of the amount of online anti-Semitic content. And again, there's that Venn diagram with whatever the contemporary issues are.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. Well, that was going to actually be my next question, because this has come up consistently in relation to climate change as well. Like, do you have any thoughts on the platforms themselves? We're obviously pretty keen to get Meta and others to appear before the inquiry to discuss how, whether it's demonetising the algorithm that incentivises inflammatory content, hatred, divisiveness, the kind of things that attract more eyeballs and therefore higher ad revenues, or do we increase fact checking? Like these are the really important issues that we're grappling with as well. Do you have any insights into that from your perspective?
Yes, I mean we made a submission on the Online Safety Act last year, and also on the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, in which we outlined some recommendations. But essentially, we think that a whole of society approach is needed, and that also requires the platforms to do their part. And unfortunately, we have seen a bit of a regression in the last year or so, with political changes afoot and changes in policy of various platforms. And, now we've moved to, community review on some of the platforms, which is actually problematic in the sense that some of the smallest communities that are the most adversely impacted by misinformation and disinformation don't necessarily have the resources or the expertise in some instances to actually monitor that. To shift the emphasis onto them to do that, we think is really quite problematic. There ought to be greater standards. There have been some examples of really good policies introduced by social media platforms, and they are certainly making efforts. So we've seen some, really good work by Meta, for example, in removing particular posts that promote disinformation or misinformation, but we would like to see more of that. And there are technological solutions to this as well, but also, as you suggested, the regulation of algorithms, I think, is key. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but there are many experts who have highlighted solutions in that area, so that we start to actually move away from these echo chambers that are being created, which are promoting greater polarization in our society and, heightening disinformation and misinformation.
I'll just add one quick point to that. Is I believe the name of the institute is the Carnegie Institute for Peace, I think, if I have that name correct, and they've done a survey in the last year, maybe two, quite recent, that looks at basically all of the major ways to combat mis and disinformation across many countries in the world, and has created some very neat kind of summaries of which ones are most effective, which ones are resource intensive, which ones are not resource intensive, which ones can be scaled, which ones can't, to enable policymakers to look at those trade-offs between how can we reach the population at large and in a cost-effective way. And so there's just some really good recommendations in there that will benefit all of society. You know, they'll help minority groups, it'll help with climate change and energy, just good solid stuff.
Okay, we'll go looking for that. Well, certainly the Online Hate Institute I've seen referenced in numerous submissions. So, yes, Senator Darmanin.
Just a couple of quick ones, and I mean, you may or may not have information about this, but Ms. Abel, in your opening statement, I think you referred to some campaigns around misinformation around the Jewish community being the cause of the LA wildfires. I just wondered whether you know what organisations are behind that particular example, who's behind it, who funds it, and whether or not we've seen similar things here in Australia and where these campaigns may be coming from. Or Mr. Lazar, if you have information on that as well.
I would say that a lot more work needs to be done on that, but there have been studies which I think are perhaps analogous around misinformation and disinformation in other spaces, like around, for example, the Scottish independence referendum, where it was found that a lot of the misinformation and disinformation content online actually came from only one or two accounts. And similarly, I did look into that specific example. There seem to have been multiple sources, but again, the authenticity of those accounts, I think, it's really difficult. Obviously, they were able to set up accounts, but it's difficult to actually know who the identities were of the people that were spreading that information. And as Joel said, it's a bit genie out the bottle. So in a sense, once it gets out, it's almost, of course, for our purposes, it's important for us to know what the source is. But I noticed that it appeared in a couple of different reports, that particular example, which I'm happy to send to you. And, I think once it gets out, it's very hard. It sort of poisons the well, if you will. So even when the source is not a credible source, obviously, if it gets shared and if it reaches a large enough audience. But in many instances, it seems to have come from fringe groups and individuals.
I'll just add one thing just to close that is the crux of our submission really encourages looking at the Venn diagram of where we can identify, and this might require effort by experts that can do this kind of thing, but the Venn diagram between groups across anywhere on the political spectrum that are spreading disinformation about minority groups or Jewish people or whatever, and where there might be a coalescence with other views about climate change and energy, and going to the heart of our submission, which is let's try to solve them all at the same time by trying to find that one group or those specific groups or individuals who are causing harm in lots of different spheres as opposed to going one by one.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating area, but sometimes there'll be an organised campaign to start something inflammatory online, and the objective isn't necessarily that issue. That then bots will go on and talk to you about, it could be about day trading, or it could be about climate change, or it could be racist stuff. Like, it's interesting how the things are the confluence of different issues can. The intention's very difficult sometimes to.
Yeah, it's sort of an ecosystem.
They're gateways. They're gateways in the ecosystem. I think that's really important, and they direct people. The end content that they're directing people to might be fundamentally different from the entry point content.
I think we had one case study presented to us, and it was quite a big one around climate change. It ended up being Bitcoin promoters that were behind it because they wanted to generate some outrage and then sell something to everyone who was making a comment. So it's certainly a very complex space and very complex policy space too. Senator Roberts has got one final question, and then we'll have to go to lunch.
Actually, one final topic. I've got three small questions out of it. Just summarise, Mr. Lazar, and thank you for attending today, and Ms. Abel. Misinformation under rational thought. Misinformation is a claim of communication whose content is materially false or misleading when tested against transparent logic, verifiable evidence, and contextually complete framing, regardless of the speaker's intent. Would you agree?
Sounds about right.
Disinformation, to keep it short, on the other hand, though, is when the intent is deliberately to deceive.
Has an intention to deceive, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you said one question, Senator Roberts. Is it this? You did ask this earlier, didn't you?
No,
No?
not of these guys. Rational thought refers to the process of thinking logically, critically, and systematically to evaluate information, solve problems, and make decisions. It involves using reason and evidence to arrive at conclusions rather than relying mostly on emotions, hastily formed opinions, intuition, or external pressures. Would you agree?
I agree, especially with the part of the definition around evidence. You mentioned evidence in that, and evidence brings with it the whole story of the scientific method, the piles of evidence I referred to earlier, etc.
Last question. Do you agree that unless we begin with these distinctions, especially the one you just mentioned, we risk blurring truth with political convenience?
What was the beginning of the question?
Unless we begin with these distinctions, rational thought, we risk blurring truth with political convenience.
Hard to say. I'm not sure.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you,
We
Senator.
can contemplate it over lunch.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Thank you for appearing today, Joel. Simone, we really appreciate it, and for your submission. And the committee will now suspend for lunch, and we will start again at 1 p.m. with one Gippsland.